In the remote western region of Burkina Faso, there existed a small village where life flowed slowly but peacefully, like the gentle current of the nearby river. The village was a place where tradition met simplicity, where the elderly sat under acacia trees sharing stories of ancestors, and where children played with homemade toys in the dusty streets. The community lived in harmony with the land, respecting the rhythms of nature that had sustained their people for generations. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, the village prepared for evening. Shepherds were returning with their livestock, their figures silhouetted against the magnificent sunset. The bleating of goats and the lowing of cattle created a familiar symphony that marked the end of another day. Women were lighting cooking fires, and the aroma of millet porridge began to drift through the air. Suddenly, an unusual sound shattered the tranquil atmosphere. It was neither the call of a bird nor the cry of a domestic animal, but something far more primal and disturbing. Children who had been playing near the river's edge began screaming and running in panic, their small feet kicking up clouds of red dust as they fled. Adults dropped whatever they were carrying and rushed to see what had caused such terror. All eyes turned toward the riverbank, where an extraordinary and disturbing scene unfolded. There, collapsed on the ground near the water's edge, lay a magnificent lion. But this was no ordinary sight of a predator at rest. The great beast was clearly wounded, its breathing labored and heavy, creating clouds of dust with each exhale. Blood seeped from a deep gash on one of its massive paws, staining the earth beneath it dark red. The lion's golden eyes, normally fierce and commanding, were clouded with pain and exhaustion. A wave of fear rippled through the village like wildfire. The elders, who had lived through droughts, floods, and conflicts, admitted they had never witnessed such a scene. Lions occasionally wandered near the village, but they were always careful to maintain their distance, respecting the unspoken boundary between wilderness and civilization. To see one so vulnerable, so clearly in distress, was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. In the midst of the commotion, a figure arrived with quiet authority. He moved through the gathering crowd with calm assurance, his face serene, yet his eyes possessing a deep, penetrating intensity. He wore simple, unremarkable clothing, the kind any traveler might wear, yet there was something in his bearing that commanded respect. The villagers parted before him, sensing without knowing that this was no ordinary man. What none of them realized was that this unassuming figure was actually President Ibrahim Traoré himself, leader of Burkina Faso, on a covert government mission. He had embarked on this secret journey weeks earlier, determined to personally investigate disturbing reports that had been reaching the capital. Intelligence sources had been reporting strange activities along the border regions, activities that seemed to involve wildlife in ways that made no sense to conventional military thinking. For months, reports had been filtering in from remote areas about foreign agents conducting mysterious experiments. These weren't the typical border incursions or smuggling operations that security forces dealt with regularly. These reports spoke of sophisticated scientific equipment hidden in the wilderness, of animals behaving strangely, of unknown vehicles appearing in areas where no roads existed. The pieces of the puzzle hadn't made sense until now. President Traoré was convinced that this wounded lion was not merely a coincidence, but a sign, a clue that would unlock a much larger mystery. He had learned long ago that nature often revealed truths that human intelligence networks missed. While his advisors had urged him to stay in the capital and let field agents handle the investigation, he had insisted on seeing things with his own eyes. A leader who relied only on reports, he believed, was a leader disconnected from reality. Now, looking at the suffering creature before him, he knew his instincts had been correct. He approached the lion slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The animal watched him with eyes that showed more fatigue than fear, as if it had been waiting for someone to understand its silent plea. Kneeling beside the great beast, President Traoré spoke in a low, gentle tone. "You are the king of the jungle, yet today you find yourself dependent on human justice. What brought you here, magnificent one? What story do your wounds tell?" The lion's breathing slowed slightly at the sound of his voice, as if the creature could sense compassion in those words. President Traoré carefully examined the wounded paw, noting that the injury was unusual, too clean, too precise to be from a fight with another animal or from natural causes. At that moment, a young military officer came running up, slightly out of breath. Commander Youssef, one of the president's most trusted field operatives, had been maintaining a discreet perimeter while his leader conducted this unofficial reconnaissance. Now, seeing the danger his president was in, his face showed concern mixed with professional urgency. "Sir, we must take immediate precautionary measures," Youssef said in a hushed but urgent tone. "This animal is dangerous. We need to secure the area and evacuate these civilians." President Traoré looked up at his young commander with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes, Youssef, the most dangerous thing becomes the bearer of the greatest truth. Look at this creature. It has not attacked anyone despite its obvious suffering. It is not here as a threat but as a messenger." Youssef frowned, not quite understanding. "A messenger, sir?" "It's a wounded lion." "Exactly," Traoré replied, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of a man who had just solved a critical puzzle. "And we must discover what message it carries." Rangers were summoned from the nearby wildlife preserve, and within an hour, a proper containment perimeter had been established. Veterinary equipment was brought in, and preparations were made to sedate and treat the animal. Throughout this process, the lion remained remarkably calm, as if it understood that these humans meant to help rather than harm. Some of the village elders, their initial fear subsiding, approached the scene. An elderly woman, her face weathered by decades under the African sun, observed the situation with wise eyes. "This creature is hungry for help, not for flesh," she declared with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the signs of nature. "It has come to us in trust." President Traoré stood silently, absorbing the scene around him. The evening breeze carried the moisture of the approaching night, and the temperature was beginning to drop. His mind raced with questions that demanded answers. Was this truly a natural occurrence? Or was it the beginning of something more sinister? What if this lion's body concealed evidence of a larger conspiracy? The questions multiplied in his mind like ripples in water. If foreign agents were indeed conducting experiments on wildlife, what was their ultimate objective? Resource mapping? Biological warfare testing? Creating chaos to destabilize the region? Each possibility was more disturbing than the last. As the rangers carefully prepared to move the lion onto a transport stretcher, one of them noticed something that made him pause. "Sir," the ranger called out, "there's something here, something metallic embedded near the wound." President Traoré's attention sharpened instantly. "Youssef, carefully examine the wound. See what's there." Commander Youssef donned surgical gloves and, with the assistance of the veterinarian, began carefully cleaning the area around the injury. As the blood and dirt were cleared away, something began to glint in the fading light. Using sterile tweezers, the veterinarian carefully extracted a small object from beneath the lion's skin. It was a microchip. Not just any chip, but one that looked distinctly technological and sophisticated. The device was small, no larger than a grain of rice, but it was clearly no veterinary tracking device of the type conservationists might use. Youssef held it up to the light, his expression one of shock and confusion. "Sir, this appears to be..." "This looks like a military-grade transmitter, the kind used for tactical surveillance operations." President Traoré's face, which had maintained a calm mask throughout the evening, now showed the full weight of his concerns. He looked up at the darkening sky, as if seeking answers from the heavens, then turned his gaze back to the tiny device in Youssef's hand. "Now I understand," he said quietly, but with absolute certainty in his voice. "This is not just a lion. This magnificent creature is a silent message, a warning that has traveled from deep in our wilderness to reach us here." The implications were staggering. If enemies were implanting tracking and transmission devices in wild animals, they could be mapping Burkina Faso's natural resources, monitoring troop movements, or worse, conducting biological experiments that could threaten the entire ecosystem. The lion hadn't just wandered to the village by chance. It had been driven there by whatever had been done to it, perhaps by some instinct that knew humans could help. As night fell completely over the village, President Traoré knew that they had stumbled upon something far larger than anyone had anticipated. The wounded lion was not an end, but a beginning, the first visible sign of a threat that had been growing in the shadows. Darkness deepened over the village as night settled like a heavy blanket across Burkina Faso. In the modest huts and houses, oil lamps flickered to life, casting warm orange glows through doorways and windows. The air carried that peculiar silence that precedes great revelations, a silence heavy with anticipation and unspoken fears. President Ibrahim Traoré maintained his disguise in his simple civilian clothes, ensuring that his true identity remained concealed from the villagers. He had relocated to a temporary camp established just outside the village perimeter, where Commander Youssef had set up a basic field operations center. The camp consisted of little more than a few tents with communications equipment, medical supplies, and a small tactical planning area. In the center of the makeshift command tent, on a simple folding table illuminated by a battery-powered lamp, lay the microchip that had been extracted from the lion. It seemed almost insignificant, this tiny piece of technology, yet both men understood that it represented something immensely dangerous. Commander Youssef produced a compact scanner from his equipment kit, a specialized device capable of reading encrypted transmissions and data storage. He brought it close to the chip, and for a moment the screen flickered with green light. Then gradually, alphanumeric coordinates began to appear on the display, along with strings of code that indicated recent transmission activity. President Traoré watched silently, his expression growing more grave with each passing second. The coordinates were clear and precise, pointing to a location in Burkina Faso's northern frontier, an area officially designated as restricted territory where civilian access was forbidden due to its proximity to unstable border regions. "Sir," Youssef said, his voice tight with concern, "these coordinates place the signal source near our northern border, in that protected zone where civilian entry is prohibited. Based on the sophistication of this device and the frequency of transmissions." He paused, studying the data more carefully. "It appears there's a hidden experimental facility operating in that area." The president's face showed the deep worry of a leader who sees his worst fears confirmed. He leaned back slightly, his eyes distant as he processed the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried weight. "This is the sign we feared, Youssef. The enemy is no longer content to challenge us openly on political or economic fronts. Now they seek to turn our own wilderness, our forests, our wildlife, our natural heritage into a battlefield. They're corrupting the very essence of our land." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in, then continued with renewed determination. "But they've made a mistake. They've revealed themselves through their own cruelty to this creature. And now we will use that revelation against them." President Traoré stood abruptly, his posture shifting from contemplative to decisive. "Youssef, prepare an operation. We'll call it Operation Savannah Freedom. Our objective is simple but absolute. We will liberate both our land and our nature from this invasion. We will show these foreign agents that Burkina Faso's sovereignty extends to every creature within our borders." Youssef snapped to attention, his military training asserting itself. "Yes, Mr. President," he acknowledged formally. Then, hesitating slightly, he added, "But sir, surely you don't intend to personally participate in this mission. The risks are substantial. If anything were to happen to you—" President Traoré's eyes became unwavering and resolute, burning with the conviction of a man who had made up his mind long before this moment. "I refuse to be the kind of president who sits comfortably in a palace, counting the sacrifices of his soldiers from a safe distance. Today, my duty requires me to stand alongside those who defend our nation. Leadership means sharing the dangers, not merely giving orders." The young commander recognized that tone. It was the voice of a man who would not be dissuaded. "I understand, sir. I'll begin preparations immediately." Within a few hours, a covert operations unit had been assembled. The team consisted of 6 highly trained individuals, elite soldiers who specialized in reconnaissance and tactical operations. They discarded their military uniforms in favor of rural clothing that would allow them to blend in with the landscape. Each weapon was fitted with a silencer. Every piece of equipment was checked and double-checked for reliability. Maps were spread across the table, and the coordinates from the chip were marked clearly. The target area was approximately 150 kilometers north, in a region where the savanna gave way to semi-arid terrain scattered with rocky outcroppings, perfect terrain for hiding a clandestine facility. Before departing, President Traoré took a moment to visit the enclosure where the wounded lion was resting. The great beast had been sedated and treated, its injury properly cleaned and bandaged. Now it lay in a state between sleep and wakefulness, its breathing steady but shallow. The lion's eyes, those remarkable golden orbs, seemed to track the president's approach. In their depths, Traoré saw something that transcended the barrier between species, a silent plea, an unspoken understanding, a wordless prayer that spoke of the coming storm. Kneeling beside the cage, the president spoke softly. "You've revealed the enemy's secret, brave one. You've paid the price for our knowledge with your pain. Now it's our turn, our responsibility to end what they've started. Rest now. When you wake, perhaps the world will be a little safer for creatures like you." The helicopter's rotors created a low, rhythmic thump as the aircraft lifted off into the night sky. The sound faded into the distance as the craft climbed, becoming part of the ambient noise of the African night. Dark clouds hung low on the horizon, as if nature itself wanted to bear witness to what was about to unfold. President Traoré sat in the co-pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the darkness below. The landscape was barely visible. Occasional lights from distant villages appeared like fallen stars against the black earth. He turned to look at his team in the rear compartment. Commander Youssef, 2 reconnaissance specialists, a communications expert, a combat medic, and an engineer named Bakari who specialized in disabling electronic security systems. "If nature is with us," Traoré said, raising his voice to be heard over the engine noise, "then we cannot be defeated. Remember, we fight not for conquest or glory, but for the freedom of every living thing that calls this land home." The helicopter disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the night. A silent but decisive battle was about to begin. It was 2 a.m. when they reached the target area. The northern plains of Burkina Faso stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape where sandstorms frequently redrew the map of the earth, where survival depended on understanding nature's harsh lessons. The helicopter set down 3 kilometers from the target coordinates, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to reach the location on foot within an hour. As the aircraft lifted off again, leaving the team in complete darkness, the only sounds were the fading rotors and the whisper of wind across the sand. President Traoré and his 6-member team began moving slowly and deliberately across the terrain. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and somewhere in the distance, the muted bark of a wild dog created an eerie soundtrack. The silence was so profound that every footstep on dry grass, every crunch of sand, seemed magnified. Any sound could become an alarm bell signaling their presence. Traoré carried a small drone controller in one hand. He turned to Youssef and whispered, "Deploy the drone to 100 meters. Scan for heat signatures or any indication of human activity." Youssef carefully activated the compact surveillance drone, which rose silently into the air. Its infrared cameras began feeding data back to a small screen on the controller. At first, the image showed nothing but the cool blues and purples of the nighttime desert. Then, suddenly, a red dot appeared on the screen, a clear heat signature. "Sir, look at this," Youssef breathed. "There's active heat emanating from underground. Someone is running electrical systems beneath the surface." President Traoré nodded slowly, his suspicions confirmed. "That's it. That's the location. The enemy has built their laboratory underground to avoid satellite detection. They've gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their operations." The team moved forward carefully, eventually taking position behind a large rock formation. Ahead, the ground appeared strangely smooth and level, as if heavy machinery had recently passed over it. The surface looked too uniform, too deliberately flattened. Youssef placed his hand flat against the earth and left it there for several seconds. "Heat is definitely rising from below, sir. There's an active system operating beneath us right now. President Traoré allowed himself a slight smile. When a lion is wounded, the jungle does not remain silent. The time has come to break this silence. The team began carefully excavating, using portable tools designed for quiet operation. A few feet down, they encountered something hard, a metallic surface. As they cleared away more sand and soil, the outline of a hidden door became visible. It was approximately 2 meters square, constructed of reinforced steel, and carefully camouflaged to blend with the surrounding terrain. On one side of the door was a small electronic lock with a numeric keypad and what appeared to be a biometric scanner. Youssef gestured to Bakari, their engineering specialist, who moved forward with his equipment. The young engineer studied the system for several minutes, then began connecting bypass wires to the lock's circuit board. The work was painstakingly slow. One wrong connection could trigger an alarm or permanently seal the door. Sweat beaded on Bakari's forehead despite the cool night air. His fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon, connecting color-coded wires in a specific sequence known only to those trained in electronic countermeasures. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was actually less than 10 minutes, there was a soft click. The electronic display on the lock flickered once, then showed green. With a low grinding sound, the hidden door began to open, revealing a dark shaft descending into the earth. The team exchanged glances, each man checking his weapon one final time. President Traoré pulled out a compact flashlight, switched it on, and directed the beam down the shaft. A metal ladder was bolted to one side, descending approximately 20 feet. "I'll go first," the president said quietly but firmly. "Sir, with respect, that's not protocol," Youssef began. "Protocol is for normal operations." "Commander," Traoré interrupted gently. "This stopped being normal the moment we found a military transmitter inside a living lion." "I go first." Without waiting for further argument, he began descending the ladder. The rest of the team followed, each man counting the rungs in his mind, preparing for whatever they might find below. At the bottom of the shaft, they found themselves in a concrete corridor lit by emergency lighting. The walls were industrial gray, freshly painted with electrical conduits running along the ceiling. The air smelled of chemicals, disinfectant, and something else, something organic and disturbing. They moved forward silently, weapons ready, every sense alert. The corridor extended about 30 meters before opening into a larger chamber. As they entered this space and their flashlights swept across it, each man felt his breath catch in his throat. The underground laboratory was a nightmare made real. The chamber was approximately the size of a small warehouse, with a ceiling height of about 15 feet. Industrial fluorescent lights hung overhead, currently dark. But when President Traoré found the master switch and activated them, the full horror of the facility was revealed. Along the walls stood large glass tanks, cylinders nearly 6 feet tall, each filled with a bluish liquid that seemed to glow faintly in the harsh light. Inside these tanks, suspended in grotesque displays, were the bodies of wild animals. Lions, leopards, monkeys, antelope, creatures that should have been running free across the savannah, now floated lifelessly in chemical preservatives. But it wasn't just the dead animals that caused horror. Connected to each tank was sophisticated monitoring equipment, computers displaying biological data, and machines whose purpose was unclear but unmistakably sinister. The walls were covered with charts showing DNA sequences, experimental protocols, and maps of wildlife migration patterns across West Africa. On a central laboratory bench sat dozens of small devices identical to the microchip they had removed from the wounded lion. Beside them were surgical implements, syringes, and vials of substances labeled with chemical formulas that none of the soldiers recognized. Commander Youssef's voice trembled as he spoke. This is a bioespionage operation, sir. They're using animals as surveillance platforms, mapping our natural resources, possibly even conducting biological weapons testing. This isn't just about tracking wildlife. This is about control. Complete control. President Traoré moved slowly through the laboratory, his eyes taking in every detail. He paused at one tank that contained a particularly majestic lion, its body perfectly preserved, a small scar visible where a transmitter had been implanted. The sight filled him with a cold rage that was far more dangerous than hot anger. "So this is the truth," he said quietly. "This is what they think of us, that our land, our wildlife, our very heritage is merely a resource to be exploited and controlled. That they can turn living creatures into spies and weapons without consequence." He turned to face his team, and they saw in his eyes a fire that had been building throughout the night. But they were wrong, weren't they? They didn't account for one thing, that even a wounded lion can roar loud enough to wake a nation. A noise from above interrupted the moment. Footsteps, multiple sets of them, were approaching the entrance shaft. President Traoré immediately signaled for silence and darkness. The team quickly extinguished their lights and took defensive positions behind laboratory equipment. Through the entrance shaft, they could hear voices speaking in a language that wasn't native to the region, English with Eastern European accents. The footsteps grew closer, descending the ladder. Traoré could see shadows moving in the dim light from above. "Hold position," he whispered to his team. "No one fires until I give the order. We need at least one of them alive for questioning." 3 figures emerged from the entrance shaft, their forms gradually becoming clearer as they descended. They wore military-style tactical gear, faces covered with masks, and carried automatic weapons with practiced ease. These were clearly not scientists, but security personnel, or perhaps military contractors operating far from any official oversight. Behind them, visible through the open shaft, was a small truck with Bioserve Research Unit printed on its side, a name that sounded legitimate but which President Traoré suspected was nothing more than a front for illegal operations. "Commander," Youssef whispered urgently. "Sir, they're probably bringing additional equipment or perhaps more chemical agents. We could retreat now, call in a larger force." "No, Youssef," Traoré replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "They haven't come to bring supplies. They've come to their own funeral. They just don't know it yet." As the 3 intruders fully entered the laboratory and began moving toward the storage area, President Traoré made his move. With sudden dramatic effect, he switched on all the laboratory lights at once. The brilliant fluorescent illumination flooded the space, momentarily blinding the intruders. "Drop your weapons to the ground," Traoré commanded in perfect English, his voice booming with authority that filled the entire chamber. "You are surrounded and have nowhere to run. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to international law." The agents froze, shocked by the sudden revelation that they were not alone. For 3 heartbeats, time seemed to stop. Then, as if responding to some unspoken signal, all 3 reached for their weapons. Gunfire erupted in the confined space. The sound was deafening despite the silencers on the team's weapons. Glass tanks shattered, sending toxic chemicals cascading across the floor. Specimens that had been preserved for study tumbled out, creating a grotesque obstacle course of body parts and broken glass. Commander Youssef moved with practiced efficiency, his training taking over. He fired twice, hitting one assailant in the shoulder and again in the leg, dropping the man without killing him. Bakari, the engineer, tackled another agent, wrestling him to the ground in a desperate struggle for control of the man's weapon. President Traoré advanced directly toward the 3rd figure, the largest of the 3, who seemed to be the leader. This man was better trained than his companions, moving with military precision as he sought cover behind laboratory equipment while returning fire. A round from the enemy's weapon grazed Traoré's shoulder, tearing through his shirt and leaving a bloody scratch across his upper arm. The pain was sharp but not debilitating. The president barely flinched. Instead, he used the man's focus on reloading to close the distance between them. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief but brutal. Despite the enemy's size advantage, President Traoré had trained extensively in combat techniques and was fueled by righteous anger. A solid strike to the man's weapon arm knocked the gun free. A follow-up blow to the solar plexus doubled him over. A final strike to the side of the head sent him crashing to the floor, unconscious but alive. Breathing heavily, Traoré pulled the mask from the fallen man's face and was shocked by what he saw. This was no African mercenary or local criminal. The man was clearly European, pale skin, blue eyes, and features that suggested Eastern European heritage. But more significantly, when Traoré searched his pockets, he found military identification indicating rank and unit designation from a NATO member country. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a criminal operation, this was state-sponsored infiltration. Who sent you? Traoré demanded, grabbing the semi-conscious man by his tactical vest and shaking him. Who authorized this operation on sovereign African soil? The man's eyes flickered with fear mixed with defiance. In heavily accented English, he gasped, You? You don't understand. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. We have operations across West Africa. You're just one target among many. You can't stop what's already in motion. President Traoré's face became hard as stone. Then we'll stop it right here, right now. And we'll expose every part of it to the world. You thought you could operate in the shadows. But you've awakened something you don't understand. The righteous anger of a people defending their home. At that precise moment, a violent explosion rocked the facility. Someone, perhaps one of the agents or perhaps a fail-safe security system, had triggered a self-destruct mechanism. The blast originated from the far end of the laboratory, where the main computer servers were located. Fire erupted immediately, feeding on the chemicals that had spilled earlier. Secondary explosions followed as electrical systems overloaded and gas lines ruptured. The entire facility began to collapse in on itself. Everyone out! Now! Commander Youssef shouted over the roar of flames and destruction. President Traoré grabbed one of his wounded soldiers who had been hit during the firefight and hoisted the man onto his shoulders. Despite his own injury, despite the smoke and flames, he moved toward the exit with determined strength. He pushed Youssef toward the ladder, then helped Bakari drag one of the captured agents toward safety. At the last possible moment, as the ceiling began to give way and support beams started collapsing, President Traoré launched himself through the exit shaft, pulling the wounded soldier with him. They landed in a heap on the desert surface, rolling away from the opening as flames shot skyward like a volcanic eruption. The underground laboratory collapsed entirely, the hidden entrance filling with debris and sending up a column of smoke and dust that rose hundreds of feet into the night sky. The heat was so intense that the team had to retreat another 50 meters, shielding their faces from the scorching air. Lying on his back, looking up at the stars now visible through the dissipating clouds, President Traoré whispered hoarsely, "We've burned their secrets, but the war isn't over. This is just the beginning." In the distance, barely audible over the crackling flames, came the sound that had started everything, the roar of a lion. The wounded creature they had found by the riverbank seemed to know, across all those miles, that justice had been served. President Traoré closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed determination. This land will breathe free again. Whether we survive to see it or not, it will be free. The first light of dawn was appearing on the horizon when the rescue helicopter arrived. The fires from the destroyed laboratory had died down to smoldering embers, but the area where the facility had existed was now nothing but ash, twisted metal, and rubble. Smoke continued to rise from the collapsed structure, and the acrid smell of burned chemicals filled the air. President Ibrahim Traoré sat propped against a rock formation, his wounded shoulder bandaged with field dressings. Blood had seeped through the white fabric, staining it dark red, and his face was covered with soot and dirt. Yet his eyes retained that same determined light, the unquenchable flame of a warrior who refuses to surrender, even in his final moments. Commander Youssef approached with several recovered hard drives and memory cards that had been salvaged from the periphery of the destroyed laboratory before the final collapse. "Sir, we've managed to recover most of the documentation. Some of the storage devices survived the explosion. It appears the enemy had been surveilling our forests and wildlife corridors for months, possibly years." Traoré nodded slowly, each movement causing visible pain. "This war was never about land, Youssef. It's about perspective, about who gets to define reality. They wanted us to doubt our own resources, to see our natural heritage as a liability rather than a treasure. They wanted us dependent on their technology, their expertise, their interpretation of our own land. Youssef placed a thick file folder on the rock beside the president. The label read Operation Desert Eye in English. President Traoré opened it with his good arm and began reading. With each page, his breathing became more shallow, not from his injuries, but from the horrifying scope of what was revealed. This wasn't just one laboratory. The documents described a coordinated network of facilities across West Africa. The bioespionage program had been implanting transmitters in hundreds of animals over several years, creating a living surveillance network that could map mineral resources, water sources, military movements, and strategic locations. The long-term objective was clear: gather complete intelligence on the region's resources in preparation for future extraction and exploitation, bypassing African governments entirely. They were building a shadow map of our entire region, Traoré said quietly. Every elephant, every lion, every migratory bird, they wanted to turn them all into unwitting spies. And when the time came, they would use this information to justify intervention, to claim resources, to redraw boundaries according to their interests. At that moment, the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, and medical personnel rushed forward with stretchers. Despite his obvious need for treatment, President Traoré pushed away the first medical technician who tried to lay him down. "Listen to me carefully," he said, grabbing Commander Youssef by the arm with surprising strength. "This battle isn't finished. Don't tell anyone, not the public, not the media, not even our own government ministers, the full truth yet. Not until we've traced every connection, identified every operative, shut down every facility. This has to remain classified until we've completely dismantled their network. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Youssef replied, though concern was evident on his face. "But you need immediate medical attention." The wound will heal," Traoré interrupted. "The country's sovereignty won't heal if we act too quickly and tip off the rest of their operation." "Give me your word, Commander." "You have my word, Mr. President." Only then did Traoré allow himself to be placed on the stretcher and loaded into the medical helicopter. As the aircraft rose into the morning sky, he looked down at the smoldering ruins of the laboratory. The desert sands were already beginning to cover the evidence, nature reclaiming what had been violated. His gaze shifted to the east, toward the area where the wounded lion, whom the team had begun calling Leo, had been released after treatment. Remarkably, through the helicopter's window, Traoré thought he could see a golden shape in the distance, sitting on a rocky outcrop as if keeping watch. In a voice barely audible over the helicopter noise, he said to Youssef, who sat beside him, "Perhaps nature used that lion to bring the truth before us. Sometimes God speaks through his creation in ways we're too deaf to hear otherwise." When President Traoré returned to the capital of Ouagadougou, a media storm was already brewing. Word had leaked, though not from Traoré's team, that there had been some kind of military operation in the northern territories. Western news agencies and diplomatic channels had begun making inquiries, some even suggesting that Burkina Faso had attacked a legitimate research facility. The official statements from the countries whose agents had been captured were masterpieces of diplomatic doublespeak. They characterized the incident as a tragic misunderstanding, claimed the facility was conducting authorized environmental research, and suggested that Burkina Faso's military had overreacted to a benign scientific operation. But President Traoré knew the truth, and he had the evidence to prove it. However, he also understood that simply releasing the information wouldn't be enough. In the court of international opinion, African nations were often presumed guilty until proven innocent, while Western powers enjoyed the opposite privilege. He would need to be strategic, precise, and absolutely undeniable in his presentation. For 3 weeks, President Traoré worked from his hospital bed, coordinating with trusted advisors and intelligence analysts. The captured hard drives were being examined by cybersecurity experts from friendly nations who owed no allegiance to the Western powers involved. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Meanwhile, the lion that had started everything, Leo, had become something of a legend. News of the wounded lion that had somehow survived an unexplained injury had spread throughout the country. The government hadn't confirmed or denied the various rumors, but the people had embraced the story as a symbol of resilience. Children drew pictures of lions in their school books. Street vendors sold wood carvings of a majestic lion standing defiant. Without any official encouragement, Leo had become an unofficial national symbol. When President Traoré was finally discharged from the military hospital, his first act was to visit the wildlife preserve where Leo was recovering. The journey took several hours by military convoy, but Traoré insisted on going personally. The preserve was in a lush area where the Muhun River provided year-round water, creating an oasis of green in the otherwise arid landscape. Rangers had prepared a secure area where Leo had been living since his release from intensive care. The lion had gained weight, his wound had healed cleanly, and the fire had returned to his eyes. When President Traoré arrived, Leo was resting in the shade of a large acacia tree. The great cat raised his head as the president approached, and for a long moment the two beings, human and animal, leader and king, regarded each other across the eternal divide between species. "You saved our nation," Traoré said softly, knowing the lion couldn't understand the words, but hoping the tone would convey respect. "You bore their cruelty and their technology in your own body, and you brought that evidence to us. You're a hero, Leo, whether you know it or not." The lion stood, stretched, and released a low rumble that wasn't quite a roar, more like a deep purr of acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked regally into the preserve's interior, disappearing among the trees. Commander Youssef, standing beside the president, said quietly, "The people are calling him Leo of Burkina Faso, sir. Some villages have started telling stories that he's a guardian spirit sent to protect the nation." Traoré smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks. "Perhaps he is, Youssef. Perhaps he is." But Leo's symbolic power was about to be tested in ways no one anticipated. As weeks passed and autumn approached, Burkina Faso faced a new crisis, one that would prove Leo's value extended beyond symbolism. The rains failed to come. The skies that should have opened with life-giving water remained stubbornly clear. The land, which had been showing signs of recovery, began to suffer again. Rivers that had flowed for decades began to dry up. Wells that had served communities for generations turned brackish and then empty. Crops withered in fields, and livestock grew thin. President Traoré convened emergency meetings with agricultural ministers, meteorologists, and environmental scientists. The consensus was disturbing. This wasn't merely a natural drought. Analysis of the water sources showed contamination, subtle but unmistakable chemical signatures that shouldn't exist in nature. "They poisoned our water table," Traoré said, his voice hollow with the realization. The laboratory was just one piece. They've been systematically contaminating water sources to create a humanitarian crisis. When we're desperate enough, they'll swoop in as saviors offering aid and assistance, with strings attached. Evidence recovered from Operation Desert Eye confirmed this suspicion. Documents detailed a multi-phase plan. First, map resources using animal surveillance. Second, degrade natural systems to create dependency. Third, offer solutions that came with political concessions and resource extraction rights. The drought's effects were devastating. In the villages, children began showing signs of malnutrition. Women walked miles each day searching for clean water. The elderly and the sick suffered most. The government distributed what emergency supplies it had, but the need far exceeded the capacity. It was during this crisis that Leo would prove his worth once more, though in a way no one expected. One evening, as the sun set over a particularly hard-hit village in the western region, an ominous sound rumbled across the parched earth. The ground itself seemed to vibrate, and a vast cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly larger. Elephants, dozens of them, were stampeding directly toward the village. Maddened by thirst and driven by desperation, the massive animals were in full panic. Their trumpeting cries echoed across the landscape, a sound of pure anguish that sent terror through everyone who heard it. The villagers had only minutes to react. Mothers grabbed children and ran for the sturdiest structures. Men tried desperately to herd what livestock they could to safety. The elderly moved as quickly as their bodies allowed, but everyone knew that when elephants stampede, nothing man-made can stop them. Homes would be destroyed, people would be killed, and the already desperate village would be completely devastated. The leading elephant was a massive bull, his tusks gleaming in the dying light, his eyes wild with a combination of fear and anger. Behind him, the herd followed, mothers with calves, adolescents, matriarchs who had led the group for decades, all of them driven beyond reason by their suffering. They were perhaps 200 meters from the first homes when a sound cut through the chaos, a roar so powerful, so commanding that it seemed to shake the very air. Every head turned toward the source. There, silhouetted against the orange and red of the sunset, stood Leo. The lion had appeared as if materializing from the heat waves themselves. He stood on a small rise, his magnificent mane catching the light like a halo of gold, his body tense with purpose. The elephants slowed, confusion momentarily overriding their panic. What was a lion doing here? Why was it challenging them? Leo roared again, this time taking several steps forward. It was a move that defied all logic. A single lion against an entire herd of elephants should have meant certain death for the lion. But Leo wasn't attacking. His posture, his movements, spoke a language older than human words, a communication that existed in the oldest parts of animal consciousness. He was asking them to stop, to think, to remember. The bull elephant, the leader, came to a halt about 50 meters from the lion. His ears flapped in agitation, his trunk tested the air, trying to understand this bizarre situation. The rest of the herd bunched up behind him, their momentum arrested by confusion. Leo didn't back down. Instead, he began to walk, not toward the elephants, but perpendicular to their path. He moved with deliberate slowness, his head turning to look back at the elephants as if asking them to follow. For a long moment, nothing happened. The villagers watched in stunned silence, hardly daring to breathe. The elephants shifted restlessly, still agitated but no longer in full stampede mode. Then, remarkably, the bull elephant took a step in Leo's direction. Then another. The lion paused, waiting, then continued his slow walk. The elephant followed. What followed seemed like something from an ancient legend. Leo led the elephants away from the village, moving steadily toward the north where intelligence reports had recently confirmed the existence of an underground spring, one of the few water sources that hadn't been contaminated. The journey took nearly an hour, with the lion always staying just ahead of the massive animals, leading them like some kind of impossible shepherd. When they finally reached the water source, the elephants rushed forward, their trunks eagerly sucking up the precious liquid. They drank deeply, and with each swallow the madness left their eyes. The crisis had been averted. Leo watched from a distance until he was sure the elephants had found what they needed. Then, without ceremony, he simply walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness as mysteriously as he had appeared. News of the miracle spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, every village in the region knew the story. Within days, the entire nation had heard. The lion that had been found wounded, that had revealed the foreign conspiracy, had now directly saved hundreds of lives. President Traoré received the report while in a meeting with international aid coordinators. He paused mid-sentence, read the message twice, then looked up at Commander Youssef with an expression of wonder. "Is this confirmed?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir. Multiple eyewitnesses, including the village chief and a visiting journalist who happened to be there. There's even video footage from someone's mobile phone. It's real, sir." Traoré stood and walked to the window of his office, looking out over the capital city. "Do you believe in providence, Youssef? In divine intervention working through the natural world?" "I believe in what I can see, sir," Youssef replied carefully. "And what I see is that this lion has become more than an animal. It's become a symbol of everything we're fighting for: the land, the wildlife, our sovereignty, our future. Then we need to honor that symbol," Traoré said decisively. "But more importantly, we need to make the reality match the symbol. It's time to go public with everything we know." The press conference was scheduled for the following week, giving President Traoré's team time to prepare an absolutely airtight presentation. It would be held not in Burkina Faso, but in Geneva, at the United Nations, where the entire world would be watching. The days leading up to the conference were tense. Western diplomatic channels worked overtime trying to dissuade Traoré from whatever he was planning. Offers of aid were made, then withdrawn. Threats were implied. Economic pressure was applied. But the president remained unmoved. "They think they can intimidate us into silence," he told his cabinet. "They think that because we're small, because we're poor by their standards, because we're African, we can be bullied into accepting their violations. They're wrong." When the day arrived, the UN General Assembly Hall was packed. Journalists from every major news organization occupied the media section. Diplomats from nearly every nation on Earth sat in careful attention. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. President Ibrahim Traoré entered wearing traditional Burkinabe clothing, a simple but elegant outfit that honored his heritage. He carried no notes. He needed none. What he was about to say came from the heart, backed by irrefutable evidence. "Members of the Assembly, distinguished guests, people of the world," he began, his voice calm but carrying profound authority. "I come before you today to speak truth to power, to shine light into darkness, to demand justice for not only my nation, but for the entire African continent, and indeed for all peoples who love freedom. For years, Burkina Faso and our neighbors have been the subjects of a sophisticated operation designed to rob us of our sovereignty without ever firing a shot in open conflict. This operation involved the systematic surveillance of our natural resources using technology implanted in wild animals, the intentional contamination of our water supplies, and the establishment of illegal laboratories on our soil without our knowledge or consent." He paused, letting the gravity of the accusations settle over the assembly. Then he nodded to a technician, and the large screens behind him came to life. "What you're about to see is not speculation. It is not conspiracy theory. It is documented fact verified by independent analysts from multiple nations." The screens showed satellite imagery of the hidden laboratory before its destruction. Then came photographs of the interior, the tanks with their horrific contents, the equipment, the maps. Then documents, their text translated into multiple languages, describing Operation Desert Eye in detail. Finally, video testimony from one of the captured agents admitting to the scope of the operation. The assembly hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Diplomatic faces that usually remained carefully neutral showed open surprise. Journalists frantically typed on their laptops or spoke urgently into phones. President Traoré continued, his voice rising with passion. "But this is not merely a story of violation. It is also a story of resistance, of resilience, and of an unlikely hero. It begins with a wounded lion." He told Leo's story, from the discovery by the river to the microchip, to leading the investigation, to saving the village from the elephants. As he spoke, images of Leo appeared on the screens, the majestic animal in his recovery. Then in the wild, finally the footage of him stopping the elephant stampede. This lion, whom our people call Leo of Burkina Faso, has become a symbol of everything we stand for. He was wounded by those who saw him as merely a tool, a biological robot to serve their purposes, but he survived. He reached out in the only way he could, to those who would listen. And in doing so, he revealed a truth that some would have preferred remain hidden forever. We saved him because we recognized that every life has value, not because of what it can produce, not because of what resources it can provide, but because life itself is sacred. And in return, he saved us, not once but twice, demonstrating that when humans and nature work in harmony, when we respect rather than exploit, we create something stronger than any technology, more powerful than any conspiracy. This is not a conflict between Burkina Faso and the West. This is a conflict between two visions of the future. One vision sees Africa and its resources as things to be controlled and exploited. The other vision sees all peoples as equals, all lands as deserving of sovereignty, all of nature as deserving of respect. I stand here today to say, we choose the second vision. We choose dignity over dependency. We choose sovereignty over subjugation. We choose partnership over domination, and we demand that the international community hold accountable those who would violate these principles. The silence in the hall was absolute. Then, slowly, applause began. first from the African delegations, then spreading to other nations in the global south, finally encompassing much of the assembly. It went on for several minutes, a standing ovation that acknowledged not just the speech but the courage it took to deliver it. The fallout from the Geneva speech was immediate and far-reaching. Several high-ranking officials from European intelligence agencies were quietly forced to resign. The corporation that had operated under the name BioServe Research Unit was revealed to be a front for military intelligence operations, and its assets were frozen by multiple governments. More importantly, the UN Security Council passed a resolution condemning biological espionage and resource theft, establishing a framework for investigating similar operations in other regions. It wasn't everything President Traoré had hoped for. Permanent. Security Council members ensured the language wasn't too strong, but it was a start. Burkina Faso received pledges of support from nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Clean water technology, agricultural assistance, and infrastructure support began flowing in, not as charity, but as solidarity between nations that had all experienced exploitation. The international media ran countless stories about Leo, turning him into a global symbol. Environmental organizations adopted his image. Children's books were written about his story. A documentary team received permission to film in Burkina Faso, creating a film that would be nominated for multiple awards. But for President Traoré, the real work was just beginning. The drought still needed to be addressed. The contaminated water sources needed to be cleaned. The economy needed to be strengthened. And most importantly, systems needed to be put in place to prevent future violations. 6 months after the Geneva speech, on a morning when the rainy season had finally returned in full force, President Traoré made a private journey. He traveled by helicopter to the same wildlife preserve where he had last seen Leo, but this time he came not as an official but as a man fulfilling a personal promise. The rains had transformed the landscape. Where there had been dust and desperation, now there was green and life. The rivers flowed strongly, animals were abundant, and the land seemed to breathe with renewed vitality. Commander Youssef accompanied him, along with a single photographer who had been sworn to secrecy about the president's plans. They landed in an area that the preserve rangers had identified as Leo's current territory. Walking through the tall grass, Traoré felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for months. The burdens of leadership were still there. The problems still existed, but in this moment, surrounded by nature's beauty, they felt manageable. They didn't have to search long. As if he had been expecting them, Leo appeared from behind a stand of trees. The lion was in magnificent condition, his coat gleaming with health, his mane full and lustrous, his movements powerful and confident. But more than his physical condition, it was his bearing that struck the observers. Leo moved with the dignity of a creature that knew its worth, that had survived trials and emerged stronger. President Traoré stopped about 20 meters away, not wanting to impose on the lion's space. For a long moment, man and lion regarded each other. So much had passed between them. So many lives had been changed by their unlikely partnership. "I came to say thank you," Traoré said softly, knowing the lion wouldn't understand the words, but hoping the intention would somehow be communicated. "You saved my nation. You revealed truths we needed to see. You reminded us that courage isn't about strength. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're wounded and vulnerable." Leo tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Then he released a low rumble, not aggressive but almost contemplative. He took a few steps forward, closing some of the distance between them, then sat down. It was a gesture of trust, a predator making itself vulnerable in the presence of humans. President Traoré felt tears prick his eyes, though he blinked them away. "You should be free now," he continued. "Free from human interference, free to live as nature intended. You've earned that freedom 1,000 times over. But I want you to know, you'll always be welcome in Burkina Faso. You'll always be protected here. This is your land as much as it is ours." As if understanding that the moment of farewell had come, Leo stood. He looked at President Traoré one last time, his golden eyes seeming to carry depths of understanding that transcended species. Then he turned and walked steadily toward the deeper forest, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his coat. Just before disappearing into the trees, Leo stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Then he released one final roar, not a challenge or a warning, but a declaration. A statement of identity and existence that seemed to say, "I am here, I am free, I am alive." The sound echoed across the savannah, carried by the wind, resonating through the valleys. Birds took flight from trees, startled by the power of it. And in villages miles away, people paused in their work and smiled, knowing somehow that Leo was still watching over them. Years passed. President Ibrahim Traoré continued to lead Burkina Faso through challenges and triumphs. The water systems were cleaned and protected. New conservation laws were passed, creating a framework that other African nations adopted. The economy grew steadily, built on principles of sustainable development and genuine partnership rather than exploitation. Leo was seen occasionally by rangers and researchers, always from a distance. He had become the patriarch of a pride, fathering cubs that would carry his legacy. The preserve rangers swore that his cubs had a distinctive golden quality to their manes, as if genetics had somehow marked them as descendants of something special. In the capital, the statue that had been erected continued to draw visitors. "Justice is the roar of the brave" remained its inscription, and people from around the world came to see it and learn the story behind it. Schools throughout Burkina Faso incorporated Leo's story into their curriculum, but not as mere legend. Teachers used it to discuss ecology, sovereignty, resistance to oppression, and the interconnectedness of all life. Biology classes studied the operation that had been exposed, using it as a cautionary tale about the misuse of technology. History classes examined how small nations could stand up to larger powers when armed with truth and moral clarity. The documentary film, titled The Lion's Testament, won international acclaim and became required viewing in environmental studies programs worldwide. It sparked conversations about bioespionage, neocolonialism, and the rights of nature that led to policy changes in multiple countries. But perhaps the most important legacy was the shift in consciousness that Leo's story catalyzed. Throughout Africa and the global South, people began to see their natural heritage not as something to be ashamed of or something that made them less developed, but as a treasure and a source of strength. The story of a wounded lion exposing a conspiracy became a metaphor for how vulnerability, when met with courage, could become power. President Traoré was an old man when he made his final visit to see Leo. He had served multiple terms and had finally decided to step down. Believing strongly in peaceful democratic transition, his successor had been elected, his policies would continue, and now he had time for personal closure. The helicopter ride to the preserve felt both familiar and strange. So much had changed. Yet the landscape still possessed that timeless quality that made it seem unchanged since the dawn of creation. His body was older, his hair completely white, but his eyes retained that same fire that had driven him to justice all those years ago. Commander Youssef, now a general and retired himself, insisted on accompanying his former president one last time. The two old warriors sat in comfortable silence during the flight, remembering without needing to speak. When they arrived at the preserve, the head ranger met them with sad eyes. "Mr. President," she said gently, "I should tell you before we go further. Leo is... He's very old now. Lions in the wild rarely live beyond 15 years. He's been sick recently. The veterinarians have been monitoring him, but we've decided to let nature take its course. He's earned the right to leave this world in his own time, in his own way." Traoré nodded, having suspected as much. "Take me to him." They found Leo in a shaded grove near a small stream, a place of peace and beauty. The great lion lay on his side, his breathing shallow but steady. His mane, once so magnificent, was now thin and graying. His body, once so powerful, showed the unmistakable signs of age. But when President Traoré approached, Leo's eyes opened. For a moment, the old fire flickered there, recognition, perhaps memory of all they had shared. Traoré knelt beside the lion, his own old knees protesting the movement. He placed a hand gently on Leo's side, feeling the slow rise and fall of breath. "Old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've lived a remarkable life. You changed history. You saved a nation. But more than that, you reminded us of something we'd forgotten, that we're all part of the same world, sharing the same home. Human and animal, powerful and vulnerable, we all depend on each other." Leo's eyes closed, opened halfway, then closed again. But his body seemed to relax under Traoré's touch, as if the lion had been waiting for this final goodbye. "Go peacefully," Traoré whispered. "You've earned your rest 1,000 times over. And know that your legacy will live on, in the laws we've passed, in the consciousness we've awakened, in every child who learns your story and decides to stand up for what's right." They stayed there for an hour, the old president and the dying lion, as the sun moved across the sky and painted the clouds in shades of gold and amber. When it was clear that Leo had fallen into a deep sleep from which he would not wake, Traoré stood slowly and stepped back. "He'll pass in the next day or two," the ranger said quietly. "We'll bury him here in this grove. It will become sacred ground." "Good," Traoré replied. "That's fitting." As they walked back to the helicopter, Traoré paused and looked back one final time. He could swear he heard a faint rumble, like a distant roar carried on the wind, Leo's voice echoing one last time across the land he had helped to save. Leo passed away peacefully 2 days later, in the early morning when mist still clung to the ground and the world was quiet. News of his death spread across Burkina Faso and then around the world. In his home country, it was declared a day of national remembrance. President Traoré attended the funeral, a simple but profound ceremony where Leo was buried in the grove where he had died. No monument was erected there. The rangers felt that the trees and the stream were memorial enough, but people came from all over the country to pay their respects, leaving flowers and small offerings. In his eulogy, Traoré said, "We do not mourn Leo as a symbol or a legend, though he was both. We mourn him as a fellow inhabitant of this earth, a being who lived with dignity and purpose. His life reminds us that heroism doesn't require human form. It only requires courage, the willingness to suffer for truth, and the strength to persist despite wounds. Leo's roar has fallen silent, but the echo of what he taught us will resound for generations. When we face injustice, when we encounter exploitation, when we see the powerful preying upon the vulnerable, we will remember the wounded lion who refused to die quietly, who carried evidence in his own body until someone could hear his silent testimony. This is Leo's testament, that life is interconnected, that sovereignty matters, that nature is not our enemy but our partner, and that sometimes the greatest truths come from the most unexpected sources. May we honor his memory not just with words, but with actions that reflect the values he represented. In the years that followed, Leo's descendants continued to roam the preserve and the surrounding wilderness. Tourists came from around the world to catch glimpses of them, to see the children and grandchildren of the lion who had changed history. The preserve became financially self-sustaining through ecotourism, creating jobs and supporting conservation efforts across the region. The statue in Ouagadougou became one of Africa's most photographed monuments. But more importantly, Leo's story became embedded in global consciousness, taught in schools from Tokyo to Toronto, from Cape Town to Copenhagen. Environmental organizations used his image to promote wildlife protection. Political movements used his story to discuss sovereignty and resistance to exploitation. And on quiet evenings in Burkina Faso, when the sun sets and paints the sky in gold and crimson, people swear they can still hear it, the roar of a lion echoing across the savannah. Perhaps it's Leo's descendants carrying on his legacy, or perhaps it's the memory of that roar, so powerful that it transcended death itself, becoming part of the land's eternal voice. President Traoré, in his final years, often sat on his porch and listened to that sound, real or imagined. And he would smile, knowing that his nation, and by extension, the world, was better for having known one remarkable lion who refused to accept injustice, Even at the cost of his own suffering, the roar of justice once started never truly ends. It echoes forward through time, inspiring new generations to stand up, speak out, and fight for what's right. Leo of Burkina Faso had roared once and shaken the world. His descendants, both animal and human, would continue that roar for centuries to come. And somewhere in the preserve, in that sacred grove by the stream, the wind moving through the leaves sounded remarkably like the contented rumble of a lion at peace. A king resting after a battle well fought, a hero sleeping after a journey complete, a teacher leaving behind lessons that would never be forgotten. The story of the wounded lion and the president who listened had ended. But the legacy, the true legacy, was just beginning. The end.